Well, it's great to be here with you tonight. I don't make it out to Campaign for Liberty quite as often as I'd like to, but I sure always enjoy it when I do, and appreciate everything that Kathy does for the cause. So what she asked me to talk about tonight, what I'm going to talk about a little bit, is the Christian roots of the American War for Independence, and it. Now I know it's kind of a staple of these kinds of talks to look at the different founders and look at quotes about them, talking about the Bible and the roots of their thinking, and that's all great stuff. I'm not going to do that tonight. I'm sure probably everybody's heard a lot of that. What I want to do is I want to go a little bit further back to show some of the progression of thinking in Western Europe that led to the thinking that underlies our own Constitution. To see the history of it, as wise and as great as the founding fathers were in a lot of ways, they didn't come out of a vacuum. They didn't just spring out of the ground. The thinking that drove them has a long chain that goes back before them, and I'm not even going to be able to begin to exhaust this subject. I want to point out a couple of things. It's going to be, like I said, almost a criminal oversimplification, but I'm going to do the best I can to give some of the thinking, a feel for some of the thinking that led up to the American Revolution. And I want to start with John Calvin. John Calvin is known as a theologian, primarily, and a controversial theologian sometimes, but beyond that, he did a lot of thinking about civil government. And his thinking about civil government was enormously influential on all the Protestants that came after him. And I want to highlight three things in particular. First of all, Calvin, in a lot of ways, was a great champion for the idea of the separation of church and state. Now, when people think of Calvin, they don't, and there's a lot of misrepresentations and misunderstandings out there about Calvin, the dictator of Geneva and some of that stuff, which isn't really terribly accurate. Calvin was never a governmental official. Calvin was never even a citizen in Geneva. Geneva had a city council, and then he was the pastor over the church. One thing that was remarkable about what he did there in Geneva, he was a major advocate for the state staying out of the church's business and the church staying out of the state's business. Now again, this idea would be carried much, much further. But at the time, you basically, all through the medieval era, you had a great contest between the church and the state for power. The Church of Rome, the Roman popes, their idea was the church sat over the state and the church dictated to the state so that the church should have the right to depose emperors and kings if it wanted to, if they didn't follow the agenda. On the other hand, a lot of the kings and emperors fought for power over the church. They wanted to appoint the bishops. They wanted to set the rules of how the church would operate. So there's this great contest. And one of the things Calvin did is he didn't carry it as far as it would be carried later. The church in Geneva, the salaries were paid for by the city. It was, the city had laws about, you had to be in church and things like that. But Calvin, a really crucial innovation was that Calvin said that the city council should have no right to dictate to the church, like who the church did church discipline over, like who they excommunicated or the state had no say. And that was a huge principle at the time. And the arguments that he used for that in his writing went on to inspire a lot of the thinking that went further and further as to separating these things. And the reason that's so important is because when those two things are either the state's over the church or the church is over the state, that gives one or the other of them a totalitarian kind of power over everyone. It's whichever institution you think is supreme, that institution is going to have all the power. Is going to dictate the agenda for everybody. And so by starting to separate those two, Calvin is advocating for limited roles for both of them. That the state has a role. The state has a particular set of jobs that it's supposed to do, and it shouldn't step outside its bounds. Likewise, the church had a particular set of jobs it was supposed to do, and it shouldn't step outside its bounds. Now, separation of church and state as we think of it today, or as some claim it to be today, the idea of separation of religion from politics. Of course, that idea would have been completely nonsensical to Calvin and to anybody in that age, and to all the writers of the Constitution, of course. The idea that you could separate, that you could get rid of your religious values while you did your job in government, it's not even possible. The question is never whether you will do so. The question is, but what religious values will you bring with you? But as far as seeing these institutions as separate and both of them limited within their own sphere, this was a major step forward in the thinking of the relations between church and state. The second thing that I think plays a big role in the thinking that led up to the establishment of the U.S. Constitution, I want to read a quote. This is from Calvin's Institutes, Book 4, section 20. And if you compare the different states, and by states he means different kinds of countries, monarchies, democracies, aristocracies, the different states with each other, without regard to circumstance, it is not easy to determine which of these has the advantage in point of utility, so equal on the terms on which they meet. Monarchy is prone to tyranny. In an aristocracy, again, the tendency is not less to the faction of a few. While in popular ascendancy, that meaning democracy or various kinds of representative forms of government, there is the strongest tendency to sedition. When these three forms of government, of which philosophers treat, are considered in themselves, I, for my part, am far from denying that the form which greatly surpasses the others is aristocracy, either pure or modified by popular government. Not indeed in itself, but because it very rarely happens that kings so rule themselves as never to dissent from what is just and right, or are possessed of so much acuteness and prudence as always to see correctly. So you see what he's saying there. He's saying you have these three general forms of government: monarchy, aristocracy, democracy. And of those, what he thinks is the best is aristocracy blended with a form of popular government. That's what a republic is rule of the few with a democratic element, right? You rule by representation. So you have an aristocracy, but it's not a hereditary aristocracy where people inherit their titles by birth or because they're rich or something of that nature. But an aristocracy combined with a popular government, he thinks does the best job of limiting government. Where if you have one guy who goes off the rails, one official or one branch of government, then the others step in to rein him in. And you see, that's part of the fundamental design of the American government. The three branches of government, all of which are supposed to be self-limiting, varying levels of popular representation in each one of them. At least in the original, it's all become politicized now, of course. But originally that you'd have the House of Representatives, which was the most democratic, the Senate, which was less democratic. You know, they were originally, they could be appointed by the state legislatures. And then the presidents and the courts, which were not really that democratic at all, because there was this risk and this danger seen in democracy, but you also had this risk and danger of too much power accumulating in just a few hands. And Calvin is one in this section, and what he follows, the things he says, is a big part of the thinking that led to that design. One last thing about Calvin that I think is really key to see. Now Martin Luther, who was one of the other, of course, leading figures in the Protestant Reformation, he thought revolt against your government was basically always forbidden. That there was basically no circumstances under which it was acceptable for you to rebel against your government. Now Calvin agreed with that, with this caveat. He think popular revolt where a bunch of people just get together and overthrow their government, that's always a bad thing. He says, however, he says, when a sovereign becomes so tyrannical or so abusive over its people that there is a place for lesser magistrates, lower officials in the chain, to step in and protect those under them from the tyranny of the greater. He says, in fact, that's the reason there are lesser magistrates. The lesser magistrates exist in order to balance out the power of the greater. And Again, this thinking is a big part of what lie in the justification that the founders gave for the revolution. Because they didn't see it as a revolution. That's not even the right term for it. What they saw is, we are the magistrates over the colonies. We had a covenant, we had a charter with King George that we would be self-governing under the crown. And now the Parliament of England is stepping in and making all these rules for us. The Parliament of England has no authority over the colonies. They had their own legislatures. And therefore, because the higher sovereign had become tyrannical, the lesser magistrate exercises the right to step in and check that power. And that's right out of Calvin. Calvin believed in the depravity of man. That means that Calvin believed that all men coming from Adam and Eve had a fundamental flaw within them. They had that sin nature within them. And that would be no less true of government authorities than anyone else. People in the church, people in the state, just regular citizens, everybody. And that's why he felt so strongly of the need to put in place things that would check the power of government. That he would check the absolute authority of government, because absolute authority would be corrupting. Absolute authority would be abused, in his view. And so he advocates, and all of these things I think show ways that Calvin advocated for limited government that had a defined role, and in particular that government was instituted by God. It was not instituted by man. And what that means is that government was there to do the job that God gave it to do, and not to do whatever they felt like doing. And the particular place for that institution is right after the flood, when Noah comes off the ark. The world had become so wicked before the flood that God saw fit to destroy the world with a flood, with the exception of Noah and his family. And God said to Noah, after he came off the flood, one of the things he said was, "He that sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed." Theologians generally recognize that as God's institution of civil government. And he put civil government in place. Other measures are there as well. But he put civil government in place in order to check the evil of man, to reduce the evil of man. And we see there the primary role that Calvin and many other Protestant theologians see for government. That government's not there to solve everybody's problems. Government's not there to create utopia, to create the perfect society. Because the problem is the sin that's in the heart of man, and government has no tools to fix that. Because the same sinful men that are the problem are also in government. Jesus Christ fixes the sin problem of humanity. Government's job is merely to restrain the evil of humanity in order to create space for the gospel to work. And you see there, you have a limited charter for government right out of the chutes, right? And Calvin, some of these things shows that. He does not see government as having a very large role. He sees them having a limited role to restrain the power of evil, but otherwise he looks elsewhere for the solution of mankind's problems. Now I want to compare that to another thinker, writing a little bit later, early in the, Calvin wrote in the mid-1500s. Thomas Hobbes wrote in the early 1600s, English philosopher, wrote a book called The Leviathan. He was one of the great popularizers, probably not the originator, but one of the great popularizers of what's known as social contract theory. Where does government come from, he says. Well, and there's a great simplification. Leviathan's a great big long book. But man in his natural state is at a constant state of war with one another. There can be no sense of security, no sense of peace. You never know when somebody's going to come along and take your stuff and attack you and whatever. And it's impossible to get anything done in that state. Industry, science, arts, commerce, none of that will ever go forward while people are at constant fear for their lives. So what happens is that people, either explicitly or implicitly, band together, give up their natural sovereignty, cede that sovereignty to either a single man or a group of people, And that man or group of people then become the sovereign over you. You give up your right of self-government. You give up your right to your own will. You give up your right to really order your own life. You cede that power to the government. A government thus created has no limits, according to Hobbes. That government then is the sovereign. That government is, he speaks of it as a God on earth. In fact, I want to read a quote. Thomas Hobbes was basically an atheist. Thomas Hobbes didn't believe in God. He kind of pays lip service to the existence of God, because he kind of had to in that day and age. But it's clear from his writings he was a materialist. He didn't believe in the soul. He didn't believe in an afterlife or anything like that. So he says this. Speaking of this giving up of sovereignty, this is more than consent or concord. It is a real unity of them all in one and the same person, made by covenant of every man with every man, in such manner as if every man should say to every man, I authorize and give up my right of governing myself to this man or to this assembly of men, on the condition that thou give up thy right to him, and authorize all his actions in like manner. Now listen to this. This done, the multitude so united in one person is called a commonwealth. In Latin, civitas. This is the generation of that great Leviathan, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God, to which we owe, under the immortal God, our peace and defense. And he goes on to talk about the only limits on the power and authority of this sovereign that's created in that way are the limits which it chooses to exercise over itself. The people give up all right to question, to limit the power of government. They have ceded that to the state. Now, this is a very different principle than what Calvin was talking about, isn't it? Hobbes was, as I said, as the founder of what's known as social contract theory, he was very much a man of the Enlightenment. And what the Enlightenment was basically all about, you had the Renaissance and the scientific revolution and the Protestant Reformation and all of these things which brought so much advancement to the world. The Enlightenment was a project to have all of the benefits of that, all of the scientific advancements and political freedom and all of these things that had come as a result of this movement, except without God, except without Christianity. How could we have these things without having to bend the knee to a sovereign God? And Hobbes gave them a way forward. Following after Hobbes, we have John Locke, again a big proponent of the social contract theory, although in a more limited way than Hobbes. But going on from there especially, Rousseau, Voltaire, ultimately Marx and Engels and Stalin. Marxism is just a refinement and a more scientific way of approaching the question, but basically comes with the same presuppositions as Thomas Hobbes. An unlimited government that arises from nowhere but from within mankind itself, whose goals are only human goals, the perfection of human society, with no limits on it, no limits to its power, and it's no accident that he describes it as Leviathan. That great sea beast from the Bible that is often used to personify or be a metaphor for the great empires. Think of those great sea beasts that rise up out of the sea in the book of Daniel that symbolize Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. He calls them a mortal god. Under that immortal God that he doesn't really believe in, to which we owe all our loyalty and service. That's Hobbes, beginning of Western totalitarianism that sees its culmination in the totalitarian movements of the 20th century and a lot of the thinking we see today. See, Calvin, because Calvin's highest goal is always God, God's glory, God's truth, God's honor, that fundamentally always puts a check and limit on what man can do. Because Calvin does not think that government is the be-all and end-all, that government's going to solve the problems of mankind. He looks to Christ for that, not God, not government. Therefore, government always has a limited role. But if you take Christ out of the picture, and you say it's man that's going to solve man's own problem, well, then you're going to pool the power of man to make it as great as possible. And the collected power of man becomes, as Hobbes says, a mortal god. And the picture that was on the front of Leviathan when it was first pictured is the great statue, very much resembling the statue that Daniel saw, representing the empires of the world, all composed of people. And people all make up the statue. The statue is all made up of, he is a mortal god made up of the collective power of man. And I want to introduce another thinker to you in case you hadn't heard of him, and that's Richard Hooker. Anybody ever heard of Richard Hooker before? No, nobody's ever heard of Richard Hooker. And it's a great shame, because Richard Hooker was probably the single most influential theologian on the Founding Fathers. The single most influential political thinker on the Founding Fathers. People will often say John Locke when they think of and Locke quotes Hooker all the time. And what's more, Locke has these Enlightenment elements in him which really distort makes his view a bit of a muddle, a bit of a hybrid, which was not present in Hooker. Hooker was an Anglican theologian, an Anglican priest of the late 16th century, so 1594 is when he wrote, before Hobbes, after Calvin. And he's arguing, and his one main book is The Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. And the main purpose of the book is to talk about the laws of the church. And he's arguing with the Puritans who are saying everything's got to be explicitly stated in the Bible or else we don't do it. The Bible is our only guide. And Hooker's answer to that is, yes, the Bible is our highest guide, but there's a lot of things the Bible doesn't talk about. The Bible doesn't talk about all the details about how everything's supposed to work. We need to use our reason for that. Guided by the principles of Scripture, we need to use our reason to reason from the nature of things, to say, here's what a thing is. Talk about natural law, which he drew inspiration from the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas especially, and even going back further to Aristotle. He says, you look at what a thing is, you understand what the purpose of the thing is, and then you use your reason to determine now how best to order our energies and actions so as to accomplish that purpose for the thing. Now he would agree with Hobbes in a way that government is necessary because of the natural state of man is to be at war with one another, just as Calvin would have said too. And so government is given, ordained by God in order to provide security and provide protection from evil. But the major difference that Hooker has over a thinker like Hobbes is that Hooker sees, while he absolutely agrees about the earthly goals of security and peace and stability in which industry and arts and things like that can thrive, but he says the highest goal of all of these things is always the glory of God. The highest goal is fellowship with God, loving God, and preparing ourselves in hearts and minds for eternal fellowship with Him. Because of that, Hooker does not see, he does not have the problem that Hobbes has of being limited only to man, of being only limited to humanity and our goals and our power and our thinking. He has this higher goal always. And furthermore, Scripture provides the overall framework for that. It provides the structure in which all of these thinking happens, so that no government can ever make a law that contradicts God's law. No government can ever set itself up as the highest sovereignty. Once again, we have a government that is limited to what the Scriptures say a government ought to be, not just limited only by man's imagination about what he'd like to accomplish with government. A fundamentally limited role. There's an overarching divine and eternal end to all that we do, to love and fellowship with God. All of that, I said once again, shows that principle that while he sees government as an important feature in the pursuit of the good of man, He sees the good of man not merely in earthly terms. He sees the good of man ultimately in eternal and heavenly terms, in fellowship with God through Christ. And that principle right there is always going to limit government. A government which is fully focused on maximizing earthly benefits, a government which sees itself only as arising out of the thinking of man or the powers of man or the ability of man, that government will always make a god of itself. And this is what we see. This is what we see throughout the 20th century. The atheistic governments, or the governments that pay lip service to the existence of God, but in all, like Thomas Hobbes did, but in all reality only see themselves as the measure of all things. Those governments inevitably become tyrannical and murderous. Now, as I said, Hobbes, to a lesser degree Locke, to a greater degree even Rousseau and Voltaire, these are your Enlightenment political thinkers. The Enlightenment political thinkers are on a different trajectory than the American Revolution. Their trajectory is the French Revolution. That's where you find their thinking expressed in its fullness, with the genocide, the murder of tens of thousands of people. And thus has Enlightenment thinking always produced. See, there's a common story often that you had in the West. You had the Renaissance, you had the Reformation, you had the Enlightenment, and it all just kind of leads in one stream of thinking onto our very progressive and modern mindset today. That's not the case, and this is one of the things I really wanted to demonstrate tonight. It is not the case that there is only one stream of political thought in the West since the 1500s. There are at least two. Two really main ones. One of them represented by the Enlightenment, and one of them represented by thinkers like Calvin, Richard Hooker, Edmund Burke, feeding into the American Revolution and its founders and Constitution. And these are very different sets of principles. And they produce very different sets of results. And we want to be aware of that. You think about the American Revolution itself and all of the quotes that we all are familiar with. Even Benjamin Franklin, as much of an Enlightenment figure as he was in a lot of ways, he was the one who said, men are going to be ruled by God, or by God they'll be ruled. That's a great illustration of the principle right there. Saying that this Constitution is fit for a people who are ruled by God, and it's not fit for the rule of any other. It assumed fundamentally that people were going to operate on the assumption that God was their highest ruler, God was the highest sovereign, not the state. That if the state was going to be the highest sovereign, the state was going to need a whole lot more power than the Constitution gave it. Think of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal and are endowed with rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. That speaks right at the very beginning that it's God who is the highest sovereign. It's God that grants these rights to people, not man, not the state. The state's job is not to grant people's rights. The state's job is to acknowledge and protect the rights that God gave them. That's a whole different way of looking at things than the Enlightenment principle, which sees no higher benchmark than man. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And when you understand what they meant by happiness and what they meant by its pursuit, how very different that would have been than our modern understanding of happiness. That is to say, man is at liberty. He is given life. He is given the liberty to pursue that highest good. That's what happiness is that highest good. And what is that highest good? That highest good is dictated by what a man is, by what a human being is supposed to be. Made in the image of God, created to glorify God, to honor God with his life, to live a life that is productive, one that is of service to others. That's a life that to our founding fathers would have been a life that is in the pursuit of happiness. Not just pleasure, not just fun, not just watching TV all the time. See, because the founders were not interested, and they would not have been able to foist a government on the population that the population didn't want. That'd be the last thing in the world they'd want to do. The government that they created first in the Declaration of Independence, the first kind of abortive attempt in the Articles of Confederation, and then in the writing of the Constitution itself, very much reflected the thinking of the population. And that population was Christian, overwhelmingly Christian. And that population did not look to government as their highest aim, their highest goal, the secure of all their rights. They saw government as something that was necessary, something that was good, they were to be thankful for. It restrained evil, but it could so easily become abusive, so easily get out of control. And that happens especially when people idolize the government, when people look to the government to solve all their problems. That's the chief danger. The chief danger is when people come to think that the collected power of mankind, all united together, that great Leviathan, is going to solve our problems. No, they would have said that any government that tried to solve the problems that only Christ can solve, that government was Antichrist. That term means something very specific to them. It didn't mean so much against Christ. It means in place of Christ. Anti in the Greek means a substitute Christ. A government that sets itself up to do what only Christ could do. A government that sets itself up to solve all the problems, to cure all the ills of mankind. That government was Antichrist and to be fought and resisted in the view of the great majority of people who lived in this country at the founding in 1776. I want to end with this. In Psalm chapter 20. May the Lord answer you in the day of trouble. May the name of the God of Jacob defend you. May he send you help from the sanctuary and strengthen you out of Zion. May he remember all your sacrifices and accept your burnt offerings. May he grant you according to your heart's desire and fulfill all your purpose. We will rejoice in your salvation, and in the name of our God we will set up our banners. May the Lord fulfill all your petitions. Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed. He will answer him from his holy heavens with the saving strength of his right hand. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. They have bowed down and fallen, but we have risen and stand upright. Save, Lord. May the King answer us when we call. Some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we will remember the name of the Lord our God. That was the kind of thinking. Militaries were not going to solve your problems ultimately. Economic schemes, political power, elections, laws, they can be good, they can do good things, they can restrain evil to a certain degree, but they're not where our hope is. This is the kind of thinking that animated the fathers of this country, the writers of the Constitution. It comes through in their writings all the time. And as I said, that thinking has a long pedigree, going all the way back to the New Testament itself, going back to the psalmist. And over in the scriptures you see, don't put your trust in princes. Don't put your confidence in a man. They'll let you down, they'll betray you, they'll fail. How many times have we all thought we voted for the right person, got the right candidate in there? As soon as he gets out there to Washington, all that sweet money comes rolling in, and he turns on it. Right? And yet we keep on doing it. Edmund Burke talked about the little platoons of a free society. He says a free society isn't defined just by its government. That it's defined by the distribution of power. So you have your little platoons, you have your churches, you have your families, you have your clubs like this, your organizations, even just your hunting club, the bowling club, all these little centers. Right? You don't just look to this one great state for the fulfillment of all your needs. You distribute power. And that is a very biblical way of thinking. Edmund Burke was a great conservative thinker. If you've never read him, I highly recommend it. The one piece I'd recommend especially is his Reflections on the Revolution in France, written at the time the revolution was just happening. He absolutely nailed what was going to happen before it even happened, predicted all the bloodshed and murder before it even happened. His thinking was very conservative, very Christian. And what all of these things are telling us is that we can indeed, as Kathy said in the email she put out, we can indeed get too focused on government. Now, all of you are here because you're interested in politics. That's why you're here. Not bad to be interested in politics. Good to vote, good to lobby, all of those things. But that's not where our hope lies. One of the things that ought to define us as conservatives is that we look to lots of different things in society for the source of its health, for the source of its life. Our churches, our families, as I said, our civil institutions, all those kinds of things. That's what makes up a healthy society, is distributed power, not all located in one place. So, yeah, lobby your government, lobby your representatives by all means, but spend some time on your churches as well. Spend some time in your neighborhoods and in your families. A healthy society is one that's going to grow out of those things. And I think that with that, I will close. Are there any questions?
What was the name of that book by Edmund Burke?
Reflections on the Revolution in France. It's not even a book. It's a kind of an extended pamphlet. So it doesn't even take that long to read, but it's just brilliant.
Say it again.
Kind of like a thesis?
Yeah, that would be more like it. Reflections on the Revolution in France by Edmund Burke. He was an English parliamentarian who very much approved of the American War for Independence. Who was against the king on that. Yes, sir. You have a question or a thought?
In your studies, have you run across anything that talks about where the idea that each man has sovereignty?
Hobbes's argument was that's our natural state. That in your natural state, a man has sovereignty. And what that means is basically there is no law above him. You see right there, that's an atheistic principle, isn't it? And what he means by sovereign is that I have the absolute right to defend myself using any means possible. I have the absolute right to take property, even if I take that property from other people, as long as I'm strong enough to do it. That the only right to property I have is that property which I am strong enough to hold on to myself, and if someone else comes along who is stronger, he can take that property from me. And there's no law above the man to say what he's doing is wrong, because Hobbes doesn't believe in God. What law would there be, right? And so that's his argument, that every man is sovereign of himself, but that when they pool together, then they cede that sovereignty to the higher sovereign, to the state that they create.
But if they cede their sovereignty to the state, then the state could not have any sovereignty that they don't have.
Well, see, again, the individual man, in Hobbes' view, has absolute sovereignty. In the sense that there is nobody that can dictate to him what to do. So when all the people together cede that sovereignty to the state, then the state has absolute sovereignty, because there's nothing above them.
But now in our system, we didn't give all sovereignty to the...
Oh no, we would totally reject that idea. And that's why the Enlightenment is not the proper model for the U.S. Constitution. Because in the U.S. Documents, absolute sovereignty is definitely given to God, because it's God that gives man rights. And if I have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness given to me by God, then no man can take that from me, and that can never be ceded. That's absolute. And the government's job is to protect that. He doesn't grant it to me. So yeah, that's absolutely right. Our system is a very different one than the one that Hobbes is promoting. Does that make sense? Yeah, Terry?
You said it was okay for us to vote against the American Revolution. Would the time ever come with our government that it would be a time to rebel?
Well, again, and this is a great big debate, of course, but Calvin would never have said it was okay to revolt against the king. Calvin would never say it's okay for me to take arms against my government. For me to, do the sovereign citizen thing, get my gun and go up to a cabin in the hill and fight off any cops that came around. He would never be in favor of that. His view was the lesser magistrate. So in his view, what would be appropriate is if the governor of the state of Wyoming or the local sheriff or the town council here says, look, the federal government has gotten abusive and they've overstepped their bounds and we're not going to follow those mandates. Calvin would approve of something like that. Absolutely. But no, as far as the individual taking up arms against the government, he would never approve of that.
What
Yeah,
if,
Bob.
what if government failed its role, though?
Calvin's argument there is that government always fails its role because government is made up of sinful men. So if we were revolting every time the government failed its role, well, we'd be revolting all the time. Government's made up of sinful men. It's never going to be perfect. But nonetheless, in his view, any but the very most abusive governments, like North Korea level of abusive government, any government is better than no government at all. Because no government is, well, that's Somalia. That's horrendous. So any government, and because the government is ordained by God, and because even bad governments are better than no government, that we should be thankful for our government. We should honor our government. We should labor to better our government as we have ability to do so. But that revolting against the government in the sense of just a mass popular uprising always causes more problems than it solves. And I think the French Revolution demonstrates that very well. What emerged from the French Revolution was far more abusive and tyrannical and murderous than what had been there before. And same with any of the revolutions. Yeah, Terry?
So the states, it should come like the states seceding from the federal government?
Not even necessarily seceding, perhaps if that was necessary, but just saying this is abusive. We're not gonna ask our people to follow those laws, and we will resist any attempt to enforce them. That sort of thing would be if the federal government got to the level of tyranny. And you'd have to use your judgment and wisdom to decide when that was.
Doing that in the case of immigration, illegals, and ICE.
Yeah, they are, and I think it's probably beyond our scope here to get into lots of individual policy discussions. But the principle there, Calvin certainly wouldn't have supported state governments doing that just whenever they felt like it. Just ignoring whatever laws they didn't like. But when there are laws that are truly abusive, truly tyrannical, and what that would be exactly would be a matter of judgment. But yeah, Bob.
2 questions. What years? What was the lifespan of Calvin?
Calvin lived. I forget his birth date. Early in the 1500s. The first decade of the 1500s through to 1564, I believe.
It's the same time as Martin Luther. Was the same period
Yeah,
then.
Martin Luther was a little older than Calvin.
Yeah.
So Martin Luther 1517 nailed the 95 Theses on the door of the Church of Wittenberg in 1517. So Calvin would have been about 8 or 9 when that happened. But right in the same period, yes.
So the second question is, do you see the state of our politics right now, say liberal versus conservative? The liberal side is almost completely secular anymore, and the conservative side is sort of the Christian side of the divide that we have right now in this country.
I would say the left half of the sphere is absolutely Enlightenment thinking, is secular. I would say about half of the conservative side is too, sadly. And that's why I think why our side fails us so often was because an awful lot of the Republican program often comes to not a fundamentally different rethinking of the role of government, but just they'll do a better job of it than the other guys, which is not adequate, in my view. So I would say a true conservative view, as it is really articulated in thinkers like Hooker and Burke and most of the thinking of the founding fathers, doesn't have a lot of representation in American politics today, I'm afraid. I don't think, in my own view. There's a few around, and we thank God for them, but too few. The leftist side, absolutely. The left is absolutely. What did Obama say? He says government is just a word for the things we do together. Right? Man, that's Hobbes all over. There's no, and so then whatever the mass decides, whatever the population decides of themselves, or whatever the elites can ram down the throat of the masses, because in Hobbes' view, if I'm just a strong man and I impose my power on others, right? Well, you implicitly agree to the contract if you surrender. And therefore, even if I just force you to, and you cede power and you give up and you surrender, then implicitly you have agreed to the social contract. You have agreed to be governed by me. And you're bound. You've given up your sovereignty. And so in that view, even if the elites are just able to ram it down our throats, and we surrender, well then, they've won. In their view. not in ours. Yeah.
Where was Calvin from? Where was he born?
Calvin was born in France. And was exiled to Geneva early, had to flee for his life. He had a death penalty on him from the King of France. Yeah.
What's the name of your church?
Christ Reformed Church. Yeah, back there.
Could you say that the one always leads to insanity, going barbarians, insanity, not just tyrannical, but like Hitler was, I'd say he was insane.
Well, yeah. So in my view, I think a good working definition of insanity is to be out of touch with reality as it is. Okay? If you think that so I believe, obviously, that there is a God. And that God instituted government. And that God says what government is. Right? So if somebody thinks government can be whatever they want it to be, and government can solve all the problems of the world, that person is fundamentally out of touch with reality. Okay? Now, there's levels of insanity, of course. But what do you see? As they push further, as they try harder to impose their vision of society on the country, and they fail, because what they want can never be, what they want cannot exist, what do? Do they say, hey, let's rethink our ideas here. Maybe we weren't right about this. No, they double down, and they increase the pressure, and they resort to more and more violence, what we're seeing in the riots and things going on today, because they think the problem is always you. The problem is that you're not complying, you're not on board, and so you must be made to comply, right? So the force increases. That's why totalitarianism, in any form at all, always ends in murder, because it can't do otherwise. Because when you have this vision of society, I am going to solve the world's problems, there is no way to succeed at that. Because the problems of the world are not solvable by man, because man is the problem, right? So when you try, you fail, but because you're insane, you don't realize where the problem actually lies, and you just increase the power. You just increase your violence and your attempt to force everybody to comply. And thus you get Holocausts and the Ukrainian famines and things like that. Yeah?
If you define insanity as being out of touch with reality, the challenge that we have today is no one knows what reality is. We have, when my wife's family is bipolar, I think, because she is totally different from the other side of the family.
Okay.
When they express themselves, to us, they sound crazy.
Yeah.
And we've gotten into a time when people do not communicate with each other.
No.
At all.
Right.
And we're living in a technological age that perpetuates the separation.
Yeah.
Because Google and Yahoo is feeding back to me what I typically look at, and is feeding back to everyone according
Everybody's
to
just in their own little bubbles.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, the only way that you get more of a balance is if you don't log in your name, because then it don't,
Yeah.
then you could draw from anywhere.
Yeah.
But the challenge today is there's no communication that's taking place, and so we're just dividing further and further apart, and what I would define as reality, another person says that that's a fiction.
Yeah. Well, and that's inherent in the Enlightenment worldview. There's no way around it. Because the Enlightenment sees no higher standard than my own reason. And if there is no higher standard than my own reason, then that there is no way that you have something to appeal to higher than my own thoughts, right? So if you think one thing and I think another thing, how do we ever come together? We're a whole society full of, well, that's just your opinion, man. All right? And in fact, that's inherent to the problem itself. And I would say it goes all the way back to the Tower of Babel. Isn't that what they tried to do there? They tried to erect a tower, they tried to erect an empire that would make a name for themselves, that would bring glory to themselves. And what did God do? How did he respond? He divided their languages. He separated them and divided them so that they would be unable to pool their efforts together. So that whenever man tries to unite, ever man tries to pool together, and that's what all the great murderers of history have done, right? Julius Caesar and Napoleon and Hitler and Stalin and all of them, they all wanted to bring peace to the world. They all wanted to bring prosperity. And the way they would do that was by killing everybody that disagreed with them. And it never ever works. And thank God for that, because you can imagine what the world would be like if we ever did all unite. Well, a whole world full of North Korea, what it'd be like.